Thank you for joining us. My name is Mark. I'm a bookseller here at Powell's Books in Portland, Oregon. I want to encourage you to check our lineup of upcoming events by visiting our website at powells.com. And you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, or sign up for our weekly events email, which tells you about the virtual events and the in-store events at powells.com. Tonight, we are delighted to welcome Phil Klay in conversation with Thomas Ricks. Phil Klay is a veteran of the US Marine Corps and the author of Redeployment, which won the 2014 National Book Award for Fiction, and Missionaries, which was named one of the 10 best books of 2020 by the Wall Street Journal. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, and elsewhere. He currently teaches fiction at Fairfield University and is a board member for arts in the armed forces. He is here today with his latest book, Uncertain Ground, Citizenship in an Age of Endless Invisible War, about which the Library Journal says, with care, Klay addresses questions of faith, guilt, and collective trauma, offering insights into military culture and the meaning of masculinity. Klay has written an important and eye-opening essay collection that should be a must-read. Publishers Weekly calls it an incisive collection, enriched by the author's military experiences and sharp turns of phrase, such as, we're America, we're good at violence. This is an astute and often enraging survey of America's forever wars. Joining Phil in conversation, we are delighted to welcome Thomas E. Ricks, advisor on national security at the New America think tank and author of Fiasco, the American military adventure in Iraq, which was a Pulitzer Prize finalist and was described by Michiko Kakutani in the New York Times as absolutely essential reading for anyone interested in understanding how the United States came to go to war in Iraq, how a bungled occupation fed a ballooning insurgency, and how these events will affect the future of the American military. This evening event includes a Q&A. Some of you have already found the chat box. There's another one labeled Q&A. Put your question in there. If someone's already asked a question you like, you can upvote it so we get it to the top. Feel free to do that. That's all I have to say. I'm going to hand over now to Phil Klay and Thomas Ricks. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Phil, I just got to begin by saying this is not an objective interview. I am a big fan of this book. I'm a big fan of Phil Klay. Here is the book, Uncertain Ground. I wrote a laudatory review of it for the Washington Monthly that lays out what I think of it, but we're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about what Phil thinks. And then after about 30 or 40 minutes, we're going to get to your questions. If I see a burning question that has a bunch of upvotes, a term I've not heard before, we will try to get to it sooner than 30 or 40 minutes. But to begin, and I apologize for this, Phil, because the news is just so awful and tragic yesterday and today. The school massacre in Uvalde, Texas.
Yeah.
And it relates directly to an essay in your book about American violence, America's history of violence. So I'd like to begin just by asking you an open-ended question. What are your thoughts on this latest school massacre? And especially, what are your thoughts on whether anything will ever change in America?
It's unbearably awful to see. And as you mentioned, I wrote an essay on our history of our relationship to firearms, and I talk about the rash of mass shootings that had happened. And, I wrote this piece a couple of years ago, and it's not the kind of piece that you ever want relevant to present moments, and yet these things keep happening. Yeah, one of the things that I do throughout the book is when I'm trying to understand something in contemporary America, oftentimes I'm drawn to sort of look back into the roots of it in American history and see how it intersects with things that we've done, things that we've developed, our ideas about ourselves. The essay started as a look at the evolution of firearms, of the technology of war. And it begins with, America's first convicted murderer who came on the Mayflower and whose weapon of choice was a gun. And, goes to, from his weapon, which could fire one round, and then you'd have to reload it, prime it, a whole kind of complex of steps before you could fire another round versus, you know, modern weapons. The Las Vegas shooter in 2017 put 1,100 rounds downrange in, you know, he didn't have any special training. He wasn't a special person in any way other than his deficiencies, and killed dozens of people. And how we got from 1 to 1,100. And so I look at the technology of that, but there's another kind of critical piece. And one of the sort of interesting threads was Samuel Colt, because we think of him as an inventor of firearms, but one of the things that he tried to invent was a civilian market for firearms. There wasn't a huge civilian market. At one point, he sold 10,000 weapons to the state of Texas, and that saturated the market, which is sort of remarkable to think of now, right? 10,000 firearms would probably not saturate the market for a Texas town. And in order to not be just dependent on government contracts and the boom and bust of war, he sort of used his kind of showman's flair, and he had it. He had been a traveling showman himself. He'd gone around, you know, billed as Dr. Samuel Colt of London, New York, and Calcutta, and he had sort of given laughing gas, nitrous oxide to people. And he developed different techniques of advertising and a kind of mythology around the guns, a kind of glamour around the guns. He hired artists to make pictures of the guns, including prominent artists of the day. He used predicament advertising, where you show somebody in a position of threat and they're getting out of it thanks to the gun. And other gun manufacturers pick up on this style of marketing, like Winchester. And one of the things that happens as they're very much propping up a kind of mythology of America and their relationship to guns and mythology of the Old West is ideas about firearms start getting entwined with ideas about American identity in very specific ways that are pushed by the gun industry. So after the Civil War, you know, one of the tag phrases is Abraham Lincoln freed all men, but Samuel Colt made them equal, right? You know, so instead of all government rests on opinion, you know, your equality is resting on this hunk of metal that can efficiently kill people, right? And that development of a civilian market and the sort of mythologies of America and the fears that Americans have, so those sort of move in tandem through the 20th century. And, you know, we have the crime wave in the 1980s and 90s that spurs gun sales, but gun sales start to drop off in the late 90s, right, as the crime goes down. And in that way, you know, when the war on terror happens, all of a sudden you have something new for people to feel nervous about, a seemingly chaotic world. And when Barack Obama is elected, you have an explosion of sales of firearms, right? The government is going to take away your firearms. Barack Obama is going to take away your firearms. And also, you know, you had advertisement and NRA statements saying that, you know, Latin American guns are invading the country. You know, a dangerous world is closing in. Look at ISIS. And all of this gets wrapped up in the marketing of guns. And, you know, we have a situation where the country is just saturated in these weapons, and weapons that are incredibly lethal. There's another section on wound ballistics and the difference in the kind of injuries that are caused by military grade weapons, right? Because, you know, high velocity rounds, they don't just cause damage in the path that they go through the body, but if you think of sort of a boat, a speed boat going through the water, creating a wake, because they're so fast and they yaw when they sort of turn when they go in the body, they create a kind of wake of blood and tissue that rends your organs around the path of the bullet. And, you know, it's you know, one of the things that I always think about when there's one of these mass shootings with an AR-15 is this 1962 report on wound ballistics from the Army that I quote in the piece. And, you know, the Surgeon General of the Army makes the point that, you know, you need to study this because you're not going to see this type of injury in civilian life. You only see this kind of grievous injury from firearms in war. Well, that's not the case anymore.
Yeah, I was struck today reading somewhere that one of the problems with this latest school massacre is that some of the children were rendered unrecognizable by the impact of the weapon. And as anybody, I mean, anybody should shudder at that, but especially a parent.
Yeah.
To go from one bad thing to another, I want to ask you about 9/11.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that 9/11 hangs over the book. And at first I thought this book is a kind of book about 9/11 in America. But the more I read it, the more it also felt to me like a farewell to 9/11.
Hmm.
It made me think a bit of a book I've read several times, Robert Graves' memoir, Goodbye to All That,
It's a
which
wonderful
I read
book.
in my 20s, my 30s, my 40s, and my 50s. And each time found it a different book, a less attractive book each time, actually.
He was a complicated man
He was. But your book
who was convinced
feels
he was the greatest writer in the world.
Yeah, and the greatest lover and a bunch of other things.
Yeah.
There's one point where his girlfriend jumps out a window and he's like, oh, well, she was becoming difficult, he says. But I also thought when I was reading your book that you were warning us, we cannot say goodbye to 9/11 until we start asking and reflecting on some of the hard questions about our behavior after 9/11. Am I reading your book right?
Yeah, there's another book by Cale Weston called The Mirror Test, and the mirror test is after somebody's been horribly burned. Service members suffered horrible burns from an IED, or can they, the first time that they look at themselves in the mirror after that, right? It's a very shocking moment, and you have to sort of prepare somebody for that moment. And Cale talked about that as something that America has yet to do, right? Perform the mirror test, really look at what we did, and the damage that it caused. This book is not a screed against America by any stretch. I am a patriot. I love this country, and in many ways, it's a sort of complex love letter to the country, right?
Mm-hmm.
But for me, patriotism is not a narrow and brittle thing that chafes at criticism, that can't stand to see the uglier parts of its history. To me, patriotism is precisely about a constant grappling with the distance between us and the ideal, right? Ralph Ellison called us a futuristic abstract nation, right? Because we were a nation that was aimed at something, not a nation that had achieved it. And that
I would say the
struggle.
Constitution is exactly a document that speaks to that. That's hard
Exactly.
to say, this is what we'd like to be. How do we get there? We think this might be a pathway. And the Constitution as a strategy for the way forward.
Right. And so, yeah, that grappling is something that I think is really important. And I'm wary of a kind of false nostalgia, or a willingness to avert our eyes, not only from things that are in the past, but things that are still very much present, right, in American life and war making.
We are a very violent country, and we forget that at our peril.
Yes.
But unfortunately, it's hard to forget it because we get a lot of reminders. Speaking of which, I'd like also to ask for your thoughts on right-wing radicalism in America. Do you think it has peaked? And just to put my cards on the table, I was very worried about it. Oddly, I was reassured by the reaction to January 6th.
Yeah.
The judiciary stood up, 50 judges across America in different courses said, there's no evidence here, and threw it out. So oddly, the American system worked. And we didn't see the things I expected, which was attacks on federal judges, bombs on American federal installations, and so on. I do think it has peaked, but maybe I'm just being optimistic. What do you think?
Oh gosh, I hope so. I hope so. I think that I think that there is a difficulty there in that there's a certain kernel of just radical rejection of so much that came before that doesn't come out of nowhere. And in the introduction to the book, I talk about a veteran that I met, and we were going to a wedding in rural Pennsylvania, and my wife, who's Colombian American, she turns to me, and after we pass, I think the 19th Trump digs coal sign, and says, "Am I going to be the only Hispanic person at this wedding?" And I'm like, "No, it's a military guy. It's going to be a super diverse wedding," which it was. But I go, I meet the groom, and then I meet one of the other groomsmen, and he and I text my wife. I say, not only are you not, and this is in 2016, right before the election. I say, not only are you not the only Hispanic at this wedding, you're not even the only Colombian American. And she says, "Really?" And I say, "Yeah." And he already early voted for Trump. And his rationale, you had a lot of arguments, but one of the things that he said to me, he said, "You and I are both Marines. We both know people who've been shot up, blown up, killed overseas. And what do we got from it, right? It's just like a disaster in the countries that we invaded. And who are the two candidates? One of them is Hillary Clinton. She's a liberal hawk. She knows the general. She's competent, and she will most certainly get us more involved in wars. And the other guy, Donald Trump, does he know much about the military? No. Are his instincts kind of isolationist? Yeah. So maybe I'm going to go with that guy, right? And I strongly disagreed, and there's a whole host of reasons that I disagreed. Many of them not simply related to military policy, but that's not a crazy rationale, right? And the human costs that he's talking about are not minor; they're major, right? And so, I think that, we can talk about right-wing radicalism as this sort of horrid phenomena, right? Which it is, and worry very much about the mainstreaming. I also think that it is very much worthwhile worrying about what we have made the center, right? And what kind of things that we accept from acceptable politicians, and I think one of the things that the book is very concerned with is we have accepted a state where our political leaders tell us that we're not at war when we're killing people all over the world. And I think there's so many problems with that, right? We've transitioned to a style of warfare where we don't have the kind of large troop deployments that I was a part of when I was in Iraq, of the sort that Obama did when he ordered a surge in Afghanistan. Instead, we're relying very heavily on special operations forces, on drone strikes, on airstrikes, on proxy forces, and on mercenaries, right? There are bases where mercenaries outnumber active duty 4-1. And there are a variety of reasons that we use these things, but one of the reasons is that they're not transparent, right? There's very little political accountability about the use of those tools, and we don't vote on whether or not to go to war. President Biden just sent troops back into Somalia. They've been commuting into Somalia anyway, so it's not like we weren't active there. They're going to be continuing a campaign of targeted killing, right, against al-Shabaab leaders. This is a conflict that we've been engaged in for years. Why are we engaged with it? Well, because we authorized the use of military force in 2001 for the Taliban and associated forces and Al-Qaeda and associated forces. Well, associated forces has come to mean almost anybody, right? And so at no point has an American president been forced to go before Congress and say, here's the mission, here's what we're trying to achieve, here's what it's going to cost, here's what success will look like, so you can actually judge whether or not this mission is achieving anything good in the world and achieving any American national security objectives. And Congress is not voting on it. And so there's no accountability. And I don't think that's good long-term for military policy. And I don't think it's good for the health of the democracy. And beyond that, war is the most morally serious thing that we can do as a country. And
if you're going to do it, you should do it effectively.
Yeah.
This seems to me one of the most important themes of your book, which is the American people have been insulated from the wars fought in their name, and that the system purposely insulates the people from their wars. And the system is really important. And this is actually where I detect in your book, and I feel as well, the sympathy to right-wing radicalism, which is they're saying the American system is not working for us.
Mm-hmm.
And if we feel it's not working for us, we will attack it.
Yeah.
And I think that's true right now. I think America is much less a democracy and increasingly an oligarchy, in which the rich in both parties run a system that really is detached from what people want in this country, and in which the dollar is much more important than the vote. And that's certainly not what this country is supposed to be. And I think both the extreme left and the extreme right have an element that needs to be listened to when they say this is not working. And your book throughout is about the lack of accountability, the lack of a responsive system. You mentioned at one point that one way to change this is every vet's favorite answer: reinstitute the draft, reconnect the people to their wars, and that reconnects Congress to their wars, and then you get some oversight. Are there other ways in which you would like the system to change, to become more responsive, and to increase accountability?
Yeah, I wonder about the draft, because if we had a draft, we wouldn't be using everybody, right? Because we're not using everybody right now. It's been a narrowed way in which we do war. And I do think that service is really good. I do wish that there were more avenues for national service for people, including ways that aren't about the military, because I think that there's something really good about being together with a diverse group of people from really all over. When I joined the military, that's when I met America, right? And got far outside of the bubble that I lived in. But I'm not sure it would solve all of these problems. And I think that there are a lot of other things, getting rid of the authorizations of military force that we have now, and including and voting on new ones with sunset clauses that, if we're going to be killing people abroad, the president regularly has to go before Congress and explain why we're going to continue this mission, and Congress should have to vote on it, right? I think that people should be held accountable and forced to articulate war policy, which will allow, people, not just American citizens, to have some sort of idea of what's going on and what the purpose of it is and how it is connected to American interests and the will of the American people. But that way soldiers will know, right? There have been a good number of times during these conflicts where, and I've talked to, in the book, there are times when I talk to people about this where they didn't even really understand what their mission was or how it connected to broader objectives, right?
I'd always notice this knocking around Iraq when, I go out to interview somebody, or I go to the green zone to interview somebody. Yeah. And at the end of it, they'd say, "What's it like out there?" Well, dude, you're running a war here. Aren't you supposed to know what it's like out there? And they were shocked that we lived out in the quote unquote, you live in the red zone? Yeah. Right. And guess what? We don't get mail either. They're always surprised. You don't get mail? No. We rely on reporters coming in and out to bring us our damn mail.
Well, and that's another thing. We haven't had embedded reporters with our military for a while, right? Yeah. I think that the level of secrecy that we allow in terms of current operations is ridiculous. There's a list of countries where I know where we're killing people, right, or have been killing people. Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Somalia, Pakistan, Libya, right? Yeah. But I was talking to Brian Kastner, who's a former explosive ordnance disposal technician,
author of a great memoir too.
Yes, he is. Yeah, a couple of very good books, and he tracks these things for Amnesty, and he was saying, there are other countries that are a true black box, right? Niger, Mali, Nigeria, and he told me, we know when U.S. soldiers die in Niger, but we don't know when the U.S. kills people in Niger, right?
And we don't always even know that. I mean, I remember the U.S. military; these used to be known as Jeep rollovers at Fort Huachuca, and that was quote unquote, if you got a guy killed in Salvador, Nicaragua, he died in a Jeep rollover at Fort Huachuca. Which is the intelligence school out in rural Arizona. And if you looked at it, Fort Huachuca had the worst Jeep safety record of any base in America in the 1980s, because that's the way they hid those deaths. Speaking of all these operations, I want to ask you about something that's really gone off the radar screen lately, but which I think is a major moral failing in America. The Iraqis and Afghans who helped the United States,
Yeah.
especially interpreters. Why was it so easy for us to abandon them?
This has been a long running frustration and rage for me, and for a lot of veterans, right? People who risk their lives for us, who work with us, they're at risk, their families are at risk. And we didn't care enough to bring them over and protect them, right? I was talking with an Afghan who desperately tried to get out of Kabul in the last days of August. And he had an absolutely harrowing story of his first trip to the airport with his family. They had a letter from a congressman, but it wasn't enough. They were only accepting U.S. passports when he got to the gate after about 48 hours in this crowd where you're in the sun. He's with his he's got 4 children. He doesn't want to even let them lay down to sleep because he's afraid that they'll get trampled. There's no restrooms. He said, do you know how humiliating it is to have to soil yourself in front of your family because there's no other option. He said the whole crowd just smelled like urine and sweat and fear. And he was talking to me. It was around 9 o'clock at night in Kabul. And he says, it's 9 here. It's not bedtime, but all my kids are asleep. And he goes into the other room and he shows me these 4 kids, we're like doing a WhatsApp video call, all in one bed. And he just looks at them with this, so much love in his face. It's almost painful. And he says, as a father, I have so many hopes and dreams for my children. 3 of them are girls who keep asking him about what their future is going to be like now the Taliban's in charge. And, and his oldest, they'd already had to move because their oldest had received threats at her school because of her father's work for the Americans. He says, a father, you have so many hopes and dreams for your child. And now there are no hopes and there are no dreams. This is real life and there's nothing here. And, why couldn't he have made it out over the years that he was applying? Because we didn't care enough, because we decided to get so paranoid about people from Muslim countries coming over here that we decided that we would even hang out to dry those whose lives were at risk, whose families' lives were at risk, who had worked with us. It was just absolutely, absolutely enraging. And I think that, and this was a grotesque policy during the Trump administration, but let's be honest, the Biden administration was not good on this either. I was meeting with activists in early May, and they were talking about all the things that we needed to do. And they were talking about their frustration about the just utterly deaf ear that the Biden administration had to everybody's pleas to prepare better for what was going to happen. And then you had that crisis in August.
Secretary of State was on vacation.
Yeah. And, I was talking to one veteran who was just, I think he was just working frantically and failing to get a lot of people. I know people are working with somebody and then they find out they got murdered, right? And
can you say what happened to the family that you were talking to?
The last time I talked to them, they were stuck in Kabul that day that they went to the airport. The wife collapsed a couple times on the way back. They later found out that she was pregnant. And the last time I talked to them, I found out that they had lost the baby, which they think was just due to all the stress, just the unbelievable stress that they were in. And, and the last time I talked to them, they were frightened. So,
I'm sorry for them.
But anyway, I was talking to this friend, and it was very brutal work, and the work is ongoing. By the way, it hasn't stopped; it's still ongoing. But he's also been helping Afghans resettle, right? And in August, he felt this deep rage towards the average American civilian, right? And one thing that I think was a positive thing for him was, in his community, a lot of people came out to help Afghans resettle. People with no connection to the military, no connection to Afghanistan. And he had a very different attitude. And one of the things that he said to me was, like, he'd held this resentment, and he realized, like, oh, like when you ask people, they will stand up sometimes, right? But one thing that I think is very clear over the past 20 years when it comes to American war and its consequences is that American leaders have not wanted to ask the American people much.
Yeah. Just a thought of mine that grows out of my last book about classical influences on American political system early on. I came away believing that the Roman Empire treated its allies better than we do. It was all those people in Afghanistan and Iraq would have been made Roman citizens by the Romans, and would have enjoyed the full rights of citizenship. They would have been recovered. They would have been brought out. And because the Romans put faith in their word, they planned to be around, and they planned for people. They basically also co-opted elites. They said, you play ball with us and we'll make you a Roman citizen. We don't play that very well. And we don't seem to feel an obligation that way.
Even if you're amoral, it's a stupid thing that we did.
Yeah.
I was talking to one friend who's been deeply involved in this work, and he said, this isn't just feel-good foreign policy, right? All around the world, this way of warfare, that's heavily reliant on special operations and intelligence, it is deeply reliant on soft networks, on locals and who are working with us. And what does it do for America's reputation when we leave those people and hang them out to dry?
We say, sorry, it's not working for us. We're out of here. Good luck. Yeah. You mentioned veterans a couple of times. One of the puzzles to me, this is a genuine puzzlement, is I know a lot of vets, I like a lot of vets, but I've been really disappointed by veterans in American politics. The people who have gone into politics. Yes, there are some exceptions. I would say Seth Moulton, for example, is a good exception. But generally, they strike me as self-interested stinkers. Tom Cotton, Eric Greitens.
There's an essay on Greitens in the book.
Yeah. Narcissist. Why am I disappointed by the American vet in 21st century American politics?
I think that the American veteran in politics, there are definitely some good ones. And I think that on some of these issues, like authorization for the use of military force and such, you'll get more interest in a bipartisan basis, sometimes from folks who have served, right? So there are small corners where I do think that there are avenues of American policy that I'm concerned with, where I do think that veterans in Congress do have their eye on the ball, and that's a good thing, right? I think that we're talking about a problem with American politics more generally, right? That veterans are a function of America as a whole, and American politics are dysfunctional right now, and so the veteran politicians are, and it's very, very weird to me, right? You think about something like that ridiculous Dan Crenshaw advertisement in Georgia. Do you remember this, where he gets a mission and he jumps out of a plane and he lands, it's like a Marvel superhero movie, and he lands on a car with, I guess, Antifa are in the car, and he beats them up. And it was just, it was cringeworthy and embarrassing, and didn't seem to help his cause in Georgia, oddly enough, even though he's not from there. But it was peculiar to me to think that here was a high budget political ad that thought that the best use of the iconography of a Navy SEAL was to turn him into a superhero and have him beat up fellow American citizens, right? And there's a way in which that sort of almost comically hyped up martial imagery, right,
Mhm.
has turned inward, and he's catering to an audience who wants to see it turned on fellow Americans, right? That's what he thinks is going to thrill people.
There's a great tradition in America of violence against other
Yep.
Americans who frequently were defined as not being citizens,
Yep.
or second or third class citizens, unworthy of basic rights.
And this is another thing in the book, because there's the kind of iconography of the veteran and the tribute that we pay, and then there's, you know, the actual veterans and sometimes the things that they thought that they served for. You know, I tell the story of two interpreters, Iraqi interpreters, in the book. One who came to America, joined the army, and went back to Iraq, and one who was stuck in Iraq. And actually, after that piece came out in the Times, they did finally get a kind of breakthrough in his case, and he made it home and made it to America. It's doing well.
Good.
I got a photo of him not that long ago, but which was really great. But I pair that with a story from World War One of Charles White Whittlesey. Was one of the heroes of great heroes of World War One, and he was the head of the Lost Battalion, which was surrounded by German troops, and they held out, and the Germans asked him to surrender, and he refused, and he kept his men fighting, and they ran out of supplies, and they were stripping bandages from the dead to put on the living, and he was a Medal of Honor recipient and one of the huge heroes of the war. But one of the things that was often left out of the popular reckoning was that his troops were from the Melting Pot division. They were immigrants. You know, some of his last public appearances was talking about veterans groups and immigrants groups, and how America will be rejuvenated by, you know, the Jenkowitzes and O'Malley's and whatever of the world. All these people who, at the time, what's going on in America is a racist and xenophobic backlash. You have the Red Summer, you have race riots, you have Black Americans who served in World War One lynched, murdered because they were wearing their uniform, because a Black man wearing the uniform is making a claim on America and his role in America and his participation in American life that a white supremacist cannot bear to see. And they also have the first racial quota laws in terms of immigration, right? And at the interment, when all this is going on, at the interment of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, Whittlesey is one of the pallbearers. And it's this totally over the top ceremony. And the Metropolitan Opera is down singing hymns about how the unknown soldier is like Christ, right? Because he gives up his life for an ideal. Now, Whittlesey was an idealist, but none of those ideals had really come to fruition after the war. And the very kinds of people who made up his very lauded Lost Battalion, their cultures and ethnicities are being demonized, right? And he says to one of his fellow Medal of Honor recipients, who's another pallbearer, I shouldn't have come. He makes plans to take a ship a few weeks later. He gets all of his affairs in order, and he jumps off the side, killing himself in a way that ensures that nobody could ever treat his body the same. And that story is often told as a story of PTSD, right? It's the assumption about him and survivor's guilt and those other things. But when I read about him, and when I think about some of the few public events that he made towards the end of his life, I cannot help but think that how he was feeling at the time it must be related to the huge disconnect between this symbolic appreciation of an abstract soldier who everybody's probably imagining is like a strapping white Iowa farm boy, and what must have felt like the betrayal of every ideal that he went into and the very people that he served with.
This actually leads to something I wanted to ask you to read aloud. If you have a copy of
I do, yeah.
the book handy, on page 198 of your book, there's an essay here in which you talk about a woman who approached you and asked how to talk to her boyfriend, a combat veteran.
Yeah.
And on the third paragraph beginning, but it doesn't work that way. You write, I told her to focus. Could you read aloud that? I just love this paragraph, and I singled it out in the review I wrote. It's something I thought people should hear, damn it. And so to the people out there, just please listen to what Phil says in this paragraph.
Right, so she made it clear that he wouldn't talk about his deployment, and she knew the bad things had happened. She wanted him to open up. And, I sort of got the sense that she thought like that was the key to kind of understanding what his deployment was. If he would talk about, whatever the bad things he'd gone through. And I wrote, but it doesn't work that way. There's no such key, no moment that once unlocked might be easily dispelled. I told her to focus not on the bad things he had been through, if she wanted to have that conversation with him, but on the good. Ask about his best friends in the unit, about the good times they had, about what he liked about the military, why he joined in the first place, about the bonds of love between soldiers, a sense of community and purpose, about all the things, in other words, that would give context and meaning to the bad things he'd suffered. We do not understand the oak tree through a clear picture of the scarred over hatchet wound still visible in its bark. Trauma has less to do with the person than with how that person has grown around it.
Boy, thank you. When I first read that paragraph, I read it several times and thought there's an awful lot of wisdom contained there. And since we are here about getting people to read this book, buy the book, damn it. It's on page 198. And if you don't learn something from it, I'll come over to your house and talk to you personally. We're getting close here on time. Just a couple of final questions from me. Ukraine is out there.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, I just see a question just was posted from David Peduto. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. It says, do you see a thread between the end of America's engagement in Afghanistan and Putin's invasion in Ukraine? Let me combine that with my question. As we look at America's support for Ukraine, do you feel less like you were screaming into the void, is a phrase you use on page 19 of the book?
I mean, Ukraine was a major media event, right? People were genuinely, seriously engaged with it and committed. I think that's a good thing, and it's a just cause to support. I feel like, in some ways, what we're doing seems resonant with some of the other things, right? We're helping them with intelligence. That much has been made clear, though the administration is cagey about exactly how, for obvious reasons. There is reporting that we helped target Russian generals, which the administration has denied.
I don't think we actually say General so-and-so is there. I think we say, hey, one of our airplanes is picking up a whole lot of transmissions from this location that are only used by the Russian high command. You might want to look into it.
Right. So in many ways, it's the use of a lot of the things that I am concerned about, but with a lot of public attention and buy-in, right? And I would like to see more structural reforms in America that would enable us to have more engagement and more democratic accountability around causes that are not so also dependent upon them being, such huge news that it captivates the American public in a large way. Whether I see a thread between the end of America's engagement in Afghanistan and Putin's invasion in Ukraine. I mean, I've heard some people say, well, America showed itself to be weak in Afghanistan and therefore Putin invaded Ukraine or felt like he had a freer hand. I to be perfectly honest, I find that incredibly dubious, right? I also don't think that maintaining a failing war is the massive projection of strength that some of the sort of more hawkish people sometimes seem to think it is. So,
that's a good point. The ability to make tough decisions to cut your losses may actually be a strategic strength, not a weakness.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And sort of pulling out of one area certainly frees you up and frees attention up to other places. So it's not entirely clear to me that's a valid point of comparison. Should I go through the other questions?
Well, actually, I want to stick with Ukraine for a second.
Yeah.
I have a worry about Ukraine, which is, does America need an external enemy for us to work as a country? was the Cold War. Did America work as well as it did during the Cold War because we had that external enemy? For example, I mean, in my work on my book on the civil rights movement, it's really striking. The Kennedy administration really only began to move on civil rights when it began worried that it was making America look bad versus the Russians. When we have an external enemy, we seem to operate better as a country. And Putin is turning out to be, again, the perfect enemy. This kind of clumsy, strategic blowhard, who, with a little bit of American intelligence and a little bit of American weaponry, is really having a very hard time in Ukraine. Is that a bad thing for America? If we lose our external foe, do we go back and fighting internally?
I don't think it's enough, and I don't think that gathering around enemies is the only way of tying people together, right? I mean, this is a kind of perpetual concern, right? William James, what's the moral equivalent of war?
Mm-hmm.
And
which you write about in the book.
Yeah. And I think that the history of warfare and our reactions to it can show that can be a quite dangerous way of trying to unify people. And it doesn't always unify people around the ideas that you thought you were unifying them, right? Mm-hmm. So, and I don't know if Ukraine has really unified America in a clear way, right? I think there was, it has unified them around that particular cause, but I still think there's a lot of hard work that we have to do. That, Putin is not going to help us with. That said, I do think that there are things that, we should think about in terms of that conflict, right? I don't, what kind of international order do we want following this? There are ways in which there are sort of norms in terms of the conduct of nations that we have done a decent amount to undermine, right, over the past 20 years.
Uses of mercenaries, uses of assassination squads. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so I think we should think very hard about the kind of norms that we want in the world and that we want enforced in the ways in which we'll probably have to restrain ourselves if we want to see them operative.
I think we're seeing also the world is changing faster than we recognize. The way power is shifting in Europe right now to the Baltic and Central European states. And whereas England and France and Spain and Italy all seem a little bit behind the curve, and Germany really has had to be dragged kicking and screaming forward. Whereas you see the Balts, Sweden and Finland, and the Baltic states really kind of takes, not only in strategic terms, but even in tactical terms like cyber warfare, really doing a much more effective job and a different role than we've seen in my lifetime. There are several questions here. Before we turn to them, I want to ask one more of you. Is there anything I didn't ask about that you'd like to talk about in the book?
This has been great. It's been a real privilege to chat with you, Tom.
Likewise.
So, there's a lot of different corners of the book, but this, I think we've talked about some of the things that are most important to me for sure.
Okay, well, if you have the Q&As in front of you, do you?
Yeah, I do. Okay, so should I can read them.
Fire at will.
Scott Whitmore, given the current state of polarization, is it possible to return to a point where the truth is once again somewhat universally understood, and how? I don't know. I mean, I don't think that, I don't know if there was ever a time when the truth was universally understood, right? And I think that, if you go back through American history, it's always been a very kind of painful process of grappling over different contesting claims. So the fact that we don't have a stable grasp on the truth is not so much concerning to me, since I think that it is something under conception. I do think the kind of narrowness of the way that we engage with each other in political life can be dangerous. I think there are styles of argument and dismissal and sort of shallowness that that undermine our ability not only to sort of speak with fellow Americans civilly and in a way that shows respect and has a kind of, I think, moral character to it aside from the object under debate. But when you try to seriously engage with, your fellow citizens and different viewpoints, I think that it sharpens you in your own position. It causes you to reflect very deeply about things that that you might have missed. And so, I do think that there are aspects to how we engage in political life where we, sort of become far too sheltered and far too unwilling to step outside of our kind of little bubbles of ideologically inflected information, right? And this just weakens you. I mean, it's sort of, it's almost like comical to me, though it's not really comical, the way that certain people on the right have sort of like almost like looked up to authoritarian leaders, right? This silliness with Viktor Orban and the sort of weird nostalgia for Putin and not nostalgia, admiration for Putin. Now we're seeing like, oh, if you're an authoritarian like Putin and you control the media, so you can't be criticized, what it means is you don't even know the strength of your own army. You don't even know how much of your own BS you're shoveling directly into your own mouth, right? Because you don't have any kind of openness in the society that would force you to grapple more seriously with the things that are most vital to you, and you end up with an incredibly weakened state that's incapable of doing what you thought it did, and vastly inflated notion of what you can achieve. Catherine, do you have any thoughts on that?
It reminds me actually of a poem by W.H. Auden called August 1968. It's brief. If I remember it correctly, it says, "The ogre does what ogres can, things quite impossible for man. But one thing is beyond his reach. The ogre cannot master speech. Standing on the subjugated plain among the desperate and the slain, the ogre stands with hands on hips, and drivel gushes from his lips."
Yeah.
And that just captures the authoritarians like Putin to me. He appointed a bunch of cynical, corrupt yes men who sold the tires of their men's trucks in the army, and then is surprised when the trucks go flat when he invades a neighbor because he feels like it.
Yeah. The other thing, I mean, I don't know if you remember this, there was somebody had cut a US Army ad versus a Russian military ad together. And the Russian military ad was like very manly men doing manly things and being tough and hard. And the US military ad was trying to reach out to like a new and diverse like group of service members, right? And it wasn't just kind of like injecting testosterone straight into the veins. And Senator Cruz responded, "Holy crap, perhaps a woke, emasculated military is not the best idea. I'll stick with the American military," right? Rather than like the advertisements of masculinity that,
I think of this actually every time I see clips of the Ukrainian military. And these guys with long hair and they're kind of pudgy, but they're smart, hardworking patriots.
Yeah.
And they're doing what needs to be done. And they're surprisingly effective. That's the military. I saw one guy was a Ukrainian model in the West.
Yeah.
And, he looks like Mick Jagger at age 20 or something. He's working as a medic on the front lines. That is the military you want, that represents the country and believes deeply in the fight they're carrying to the enemy.
And I think it's worth noting which politicians are total suckers for ridiculous authoritarian propaganda. Catherine Voiles writes, I observe that so many of my fellow Americans flying flags that are a riff on the American flag, but aren't the flag itself. The thin blue line is an example. As a Marine Corps combat vet wife, I feel like, please just fly the American flag. I wonder what you think of this trend of Americans proudly flying something that evokes the flag, but isn't it? I mean, this is one of those things where it's like you can, it often really depends on the use of it. You know, there are things that are totally inappropriate to do with the American flag, according to the official rules. But like, do we really have a huge objection to Hulk Hogan in the shirt playing the American flag guitar? I don't know. I think that there's a certain amount of like kitschy American relationship to the American flag that I actually kind of like a lot. I think, you know, one of the things is when it seems to get appropriated very, very narrowly, right? But it's sort of more on a case by case basis, I guess. I don't know. What do you think, Tom?
I like that answer. There is a nice kitschiness to the American love of the flag, and kind of. I remember talking to an Italian boat manufacturer, and he said, "Our American CEO said, why do you put Italian colors?" He said, "Because nobody in Italy would care." He said, "You Americans, you love your flag," and I think you're right. That kitschy representation does reflect a kind of cheesy American love of the flag, and
Yeah.
frankly, I do like that.
Yeah.
I always actually like seeing the American flag on soldiers' shoulders.
Yeah.
It kind of reminds that's really ultimately what you represent here, and you don't see it, by the way, on mercenary soldiers' shoulders. And it reminded me that they were not there to represent the American people. They were there for the paycheck. And they fought on a different set of rules, and they didn't follow the UCMJ. And that was a bad thing to have on the battlefield representing America.
Yeah.
I think you have
Anonymous.
time for one more question. You want to?
All right. Yeah. Anonymous attendee says, do you see any dangers in the overuse of non-military combatants, some in Ukraine? Do you believe efforts by those like Eric Prince are viable substitutes for American armed forces under civilian control? You both do good work. Thanks. I'm not a fan of the growth of mercenarism. I think that, and there's a whole variety of reasons that it's dangerous. I mean, you know, one of the things is that we're relying very heavily on mercenaries, and they're developing extremely sophisticated skills, right? You know, we have developed the most sophisticated mechanism for targeting and killing people that the world has ever seen, right? As Bob Gates say, a totally unique capability in history. And we rely on mercenaries for a decent amount of that. And I think the political benefits of mercenaries are one of the reasons. And the fact that they don't represent the American people. And then they go around and you know, go to the next highest bidder. I think it's an extremely, extremely dangerous trend. You've got an explosion of mercenaries around the world post 9/11. The United States is not solely responsible for that, but it's a big driver of it. And it's a big driver of highly, highly skilled mercenarism around the world. And you know, every once in a while you'll hear about some ridiculous use of mercenaries, right? Whether it was the attempted invasion of Venezuela, right, by Jordan Goudreau, or you know, like the assassination in Haiti, where you know you had Colombian mercenaries who were being hired, and you know, there was an assassination campaign led by mercenaries in Yemen. A lot of those folks with experience in the United States. I mean, there's a lot of disturbing things that are happening around the world due to mercenarism. And I don't think that even if there are instances where you think like, oh, the mercenaries could be effective in this one regard, when the ways that we use violence, we need to think about the second and third order consequences of that. If we have learned nothing else from the invasion of Iraq, please let us consider that. And mercenarism is certainly one that is a whole can of worms.
It does worry me. I think in a few years, you know, if you see a bunch of Chinese troops somewhere in Africa, and the Chinese government will say, "Oh, those aren't People's Liberation Army; That's the Shanghai Double Happiness Security Company. Call them up if you've got a complaint. And it's going to be exactly what we did, but carried out more clumsily in execution of Chinese foreign policy goals in countries like Africa. In nations in Africa.
Yeah. I want to say one other thing before we leave. They have put a link to Tom's books in the chat. Definitely pick those up. And you have a new book that is coming out. Do you want to tell people what it is? I'm really, really looking forward to this one.
Sure. I actually think it's my best written book. It's called Waging a Good War. It's a military history of the civil rights movement, saying we all know what the civil rights movement achieved. This is how it achieved it. A very disciplined, dignified organization, which took care of immense amounts of small details through recruiting, training, indoctrination, and finally, execution in direct action like demonstrations. That it was an extraordinary achievement that has not really been appreciated, and you really need the military perspective to illuminate that.
Great. Tom,
thank you
so
very
much.
much, Phil. This has been terrific. I enjoyed it, and we both saved a couple $100 on a psychiatric session.
All right.
Good to talk to you.
Likewise.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you, Thomas. That was a privilege to witness such a smart and heartfelt conversation. I really appreciate being able to hear that. Yeah, we have this book, Uncertain Ground. We'd love it if you bought a copy. We'd also love it if you bought it from powells.com. While you were there, as Phil pointed out, you can pick up Thomas's books. You can pick up Phil's other books, powells.com for that. And also while you're there, you can see all of our upcoming events. We hope to see you at them soon. And Phil and Thomas, thanks again. We'd love to see you in the store next time.
Absolutely.
Good luck with your books.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much. Have a good night.